Hey everyone, this is our next topic here on acids, bases, and what is called pH. So this topic focuses around understanding what acids and bases are, how we measure acids based on a scale called the pH scale, and um, we want to relate it to, again, think of, biology, think of what we're studying, and we're studying life and living organisms. And so lots of things, lots of living cells and living organisms can be impacted by various acids and bases in our environment. So think of, you've probably heard of acid rain and how that can affect aquatic ecosystems and all the microorganisms and the fish that live in there, or even such things as detergents and fertilizers that get into our soils and also leach into aquatic ecosystems. These phosphates and detergents can be different types of bases, and all of these things can be problematic for the living world. So it's important for us to have some sort of discussion around these acids, bases, and the pH scale. So to start off with, I want you to think about what we talked in the last set of notes about how water is a solvent, okay? And so what that means is that, like I showed in yesterday's notes, so we can look at this picture here, right, where water acts as a solvent, dissolving different kinds of materials. And so this has an impact on how water can also dissolve things like acids and bases. So water is like what we've referred to as our universal solvent of life. And if we take this picture here looking at these cells, we can see that these cells are bathed in a fluid, this green layer, and the fluid inside the cell is yellow. And those are predominantly water. And so remember, we talked about water being a solvent, and it dissolves things like solutes, and those could be salts that are in this fluid between cells or in cells. They could be things that are acids and proteins and even sugars and carbohydrates. And anyhow, regardless of whether it's a single cell or multicellular organism, cells are bathed inside and out in aqueous solutions. So aqueous solutions simply mean that water is the solvent and there are lots of solutes dissolved in that. All right. We say intracellular for inside the cell or extracellular for outside the cell. All right. And given that if we consider our bodies, we're made up of about 50 trillion or so cells, uh, in and in addition to the blood vessels that surround all of our cells that are also water, we can kind of understand how we're 60% water. So there's a chemical reaction that's really important with water, and it's this one that's shown right here. And we've learned already, right, that in a chemical reaction, the stuff on the left side of the arrow here is called the reactant. So in this case, water is playing the role of a reactant. The pen is a bit tricky here. And so these two substances, what happens when water sort of splits apart, we can see that it produces this OH minus, right? So this is over here, these things are called products, right? And so we've got two products that come from water splitting apart. This one here is called the hydroxide ion, all right? The hydroxide ion, remember, because ions are charged. And over here we have the hydrogen ion. So we've got one plus and one minus, right? And so these two substances are what define acids and bases. It might seem funny, they come from water, but remember how when the parts of a compound, um, when the individual parts come together, their properties are often different than when they're split apart. So I want you to think about that with respect to these two substances. So even though water is very different than these two substances, it's made up of those substances. And when we refer to bases, we're talking about this hydroxide ion when we refer to acids, we're talking about the hydrogen ion, okay? So it says, although ions OH minus and H plus ions come from water, splitting apart, they have very different properties than water itself. The hydroxide ion is a base, and the hydrogen ion is an acid. Now, this is just the case for water, it splits apart, but there are many other different materials that can produce this. My pen is really on the fritz, so I apologize. I'm just trying to get it working. So there's lots of different kinds of materials that can produce hydroxide ions or hydrogen ions. So here's some examples of some strong acids. So we have this substance here, it's called HCl, and I think we've talked about this maybe, hydrochloric acid. And when you combine it with water, right, so water is the solvent, all right, and it's going to dissolve that hydrochloric acid and it's going to produce H plus and Cl minus. And so because this is produced in the solution, there's our acid that we were talking about. All right, now this acid we can find in our stomach. It's gastric acid. So here's a picture of the stomach over here, and in a minute we'll talk about the pH scale, but we can see that stomach acid has a pH of about 1. It might vary a little bit, but around pH 1, 2, somewhere in there. All right, and it's all because this hydrochloric acid, when it's put into water, produces hydrogen ions. Here's an example of a weak acid. This one is called acetic acid. And if you're familiar with acetic acid, well, I think just about everybody will be familiar with acetic acid. Its common name is vinegar, right? So again, if we look, no, it's not on the scale, but vinegar would be probably right around the same level as tomato juice. Tomato juice, probably around a 4, 4.5 on the pH scale. So we say it's a weak acid, not quite as strong, right? And again, when it splits, when we add it to water, it separates, producing the hydrogen ion, and so therefore an acid. A couple of examples of bases. So here we've got sodium hydroxide. Sodium hydroxide, I don't know if it's over here on the scale, but sodium hydroxide would be in the range of a strong base. A lot of bases are cleaners. If you look, you've got hand soap. Here's an ammonia solution, which you find in like Windex, bleach, of course, and then there's some concentrated solutions here of alkalis, like sodium hydroxide you find in oven cleaner, potassium hydroxide you find in liquid Drano, right, that you pour down the pipes to clean them out. And so with the base, what happens when you add it to water is, again, the water dissolves the sodium hydroxide and it produces the hydroxide ion. So here's our hydroxide ion, and that's what makes this a base. Okay. All right, I just paused the video. If you want to pause the video and write this down, I tried to clean things up a little bit, my pen on the fritz. Now, here we can actually see the hydroxide in the sodium hydroxide, and when it separates, we get the hydroxide over here. Now, we can also have something that is a base that doesn't show the hydroxide, but what it does is it will still produce hydroxide. So in this case, what happens is this ammonia over here, it rips off a hydrogen from water, and that produces this NH4 ammonium, and it leaves the water as OH minus. So still the same thing. It's a base because it produces hydroxide ions. Okay. Now it says down at the bottom, recall that one of the major characteristics of living things is homeostasis. In many organisms, maintaining a relatively constant pH is critical to their survival. Okay, so when we talk about these things that are acids or these things that are bases, then what happens when they end up in these environments, like let's say we have acid in our blood, if we were to end up with some acids in our blood, that could cause the pH of our blood to drop, and this could be extremely detrimental to our health. Similarly, if we were to end up with some bases, right, that was absorbed through possibly our skin, through maybe poisoning or something like that, getting stuff on our skin, why it's important to wear gloves when you're using really, heavy duty cleaners and stuff like that. but it could be something that we've eaten, right? It could be something in the air that we breathe, right? Obviously, it doesn't happen day to day, but even things like excessive exercise, right? Or even just exercise in general, intense activity can cause our blood to become somewhat acidic. And this could be detrimental to our health if it were not for the presence of buffers. All right, so we can see down here, right? Fortunately, in many complex multicellular organisms, we have the presence of buffers, all right? And these buffers are essentially chemical substances, chemical substances. I'm going to try and pause this and get my pen working. Sorry, I paused the video and tried to write this down, and it took a little while to get my pen working. So think of it as this, right? Any living cell, an individual cell, or a multicellular organism uh, could be impacted by various acids or bases, all right? And so if we look on this little pH scale here, pH is a measure of H plus. And it works a little bit backwards. The lower the number, the more acidic, right? So the lower the pH, the more acidic. At around 7, right, we have what we call neutrals. So the solution's neither acidic or basic. And at 14, as we go up from 7, we get materials or chemicals that are more basic. So at this end, you have more H plus, right? So you have lots of H plus and very little OH minus. At this level, the H plus is equal to the OH minus. H plus equals OH minus. So that's why we call it neutral. And at this end, the OH minus is way greater than the H plus. And I'll talk about these numbers on Monday, so don't stress about that. We're not going to do too much on there. But long and short of it is pH is a measure of how acidic or basic something is. Organisms could be susceptible to these things in their cells, and they could be damaging. And so more complex organisms have ways of dealing with these acidic and basic substances. And these things are called buffers. And basically, if for example, let's say you were to, gnaw on a lemon, well, it's very acidic. It would be absorbed into your bloodstream, and it could cause the pH of your blood to drop quite a bit, which would be quite bad. But fortunately for us, we have buffers in the form of bicarbonate down here, this chemical, and phosphates in our blood that can help take up that excess acid and keep the pH of our blood constant. Okay? So that's it for our little at-home notes this weekend. I will go over this stuff on Monday, and we'll definitely do a little Q&A. But enjoy the rest of your weekend, or if it's Sunday night, we'll see you tomorrow. Cheers.